Deep in the Oregon wilderness, hidden among ancient pines, stood a Victorian mansion known locally as the Woodland Institute. From 1902 to 1937, it operated as a revolutionary treatment center for troubled minds. Government records show that 712 patients entered its ornate doors. According to recently declassified FBI documents, fewer than 300 ever left alive. Tonight, we uncover the horrifying truth behind America's most notorious psychiatric facility and the brilliant, deranged doctor who turned healing into horror. Before we continue, this channel explores the darkest chapters of American history that were deliberately erased from our textbooks. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped our nation, hit that subscribe button now. Let me know in the comments which state you're watching from. Are you brave enough to join our community of truth seekers? Let's find out. What makes this story particularly disturbing isn't just the astronomical death toll, but how respected the Woodland Institute was among America's medical elite. Dr. Eleanor Maxwell wasn't hiding in shadows. She was publishing in medical journals and hosting symposiums while conducting experiments that would make Joseph Mengele shudder. The small town of Cascade Falls, Oregon was barely a mark on maps when Dr. Maxwell arrived in the spring of 1902. The logging community of roughly 400 souls existed primarily to service the booming timber industry that was clearing the ancient forests for America's westward expansion. The town had little to recommend it beyond its breathtaking mountain views and isolation from larger population centers, exactly what Dr. Maxwell was seeking. She arrived on a crisp April morning, stepping off the newly established railway connection with the bearing of royalty. At 38, Dr. Eleanor Maxwell cut an imposing figure, tall and statuesque with sharp features framed by copper hair prematurely streaked with silver. Her piercing green eyes seemed to evaluate everything with clinical precision. Her British accent and impeccable manners immediately set her apart from the rough-hewn loggers and shopkeepers who populated Cascade Falls. Accompanying her was her assistant, Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a gaunt man in his early 30s whose hollow cheeks and perpetual pallor suggested a lifetime spent indoors. His movements were methodical and precise, his pale gray eyes constantly scanning his surroundings as if searching for threats or opportunities. When he spoke, which was rarely, his soft voice carried the refined accent of Boston's elite educational institutions. The third member of their party was Miss Abigail Pierce, barely 25 years old with a delicate beauty that seemed at odds with her chosen profession. Her chestnut hair was always perfectly arranged, her porcelain complexion unmarred by the harsh frontier conditions. But there was something unsettling in her smile, a coldness that never reached her dark eyes, which studied everyone she met with uncomfortable intensity. The trio arrived with impressive credentials. Dr. Maxwell presented herself as a pioneer in psychiatric medicine who had trained at Oxford before coming to America to establish a progressive treatment facility for women suffering from nervous disorders. Her letters of introduction from prominent East Coast physicians and wealthy Boston families opened doors that might otherwise have remained firmly closed to newcomers. Dr. Maxwell paid 3 times the asking price for the abandoned Holbrook estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion built by a lumber baron who had lost his fortune in the Panic of 1893. The ornate building had sat empty for nearly a decade, its once grand halls gathering dust as the forest slowly reclaimed the surrounding grounds. Within days of her arrival, Dr. Maxwell had hired every available worker in Cascade Falls to restore and modify the structure according to her exacting specifications. The renovations raised eyebrows among the construction crews. The basement required extensive reinforcement with thick concrete walls and drainage systems that seemed excessive for simple storage. Soundproofing materials were installed throughout the building, which Dr. Maxwell explained were necessary for the peace and tranquility of her future patients. Most concerning were the heavy metal doors with sophisticated locking mechanisms installed on what would become patient rooms, features more appropriate for a prison than a healing facility. When questioned about these unusual modifications, Dr. Maxwell would smile with practiced patience and explain, "True healing requires complete separation from the stresses of modern life. We create a controlled environment where the mind can reset itself without external influences." Her explanations, delivered with medical authority and accompanied by generous payments, satisfied most questions. Those who remained skeptical were quieted by the economic boom the Institute brought to Cascade Falls. Dr. Maxwell spared no expense, importing specialized equipment from Europe, hiring local staff at unprecedented wages, and establishing supply contracts with local businesses that injected more money into the small community than it had seen in decades. By October 1902, the Woodland Institute for Nervous Disorders was ready to receive its first patients. The renovated mansion stood transformed, its Victorian extravagance softened into tasteful elegance on the upper floors, while the basement had been converted into what Dr. Maxwell described as specialized treatment rooms for advanced therapeutic procedures. The Institute's first patients began arriving in November, daughters of wealthy East Coast families whose hysterical tendencies or inappropriate independence had become sources of social embarrassment. Young women who had refused suitable marriages, shown too much interest in education, or demonstrated sexual desires deemed excessive or inappropriate. Alongside them came wives whose emotional outbursts, intellectual curiosities, or resistance to their husband's authority had been diagnosed as mental illness requiring professional intervention. Dr. Arnold Whitcomb, the elderly physician who served Cascade Falls and surrounding communities, initially welcomed the Institute as a sign of progress. Dr. Maxwell's understanding of feminine psychology far exceeds anything in current American practice, he wrote in a letter to a medical colleague. Her methods, while unconventional, address the root causes of nervous disorders rather than merely suppressing symptoms. What Dr. Whitcomb didn't mention was the lucrative arrangement he had struck with Dr. Maxwell. For each local patient he referred to the Institute, he received a handsome commission. For supplying medical materials and signing death certificates without asking uncomfortable questions, his monthly stipend exceeded his previous annual income. Word of the Woodland Institute spread through whispered recommendations among America's elite families. Those with troublesome female relatives were told of a discreet facility in Oregon where modern treatments could transform rebellious girls into proper ladies and hysterical wives into docile companions. The cost was substantial: $100 for a month's treatment, $250 for 3 months, and $500 for what Dr. Maxwell called complete rehabilitation. But for wealthy families, it seemed a small price to pay for restored social harmony. The first sign that something was deeply wrong at the Woodland Institute came in February 1904, when local hunter Michael Donovan was tracking deer through the forest surrounding the facility. As twilight descended on the winter landscape, he found himself closer to the Institute than he had intended. From his position among the trees, he could see the basement windows glowing with unnatural brightness while the rest of the building remained dark. What he witnessed through those windows haunted him for the remainder of his life. The basement had been transformed into what could only be described as a surgical theater, brilliantly lit by electric lights that few rural Oregon communities had yet installed. A young woman was strapped to an operating table, her head immobilized in a metal frame that reminded Donovan of a medieval torture device. The patient was clearly conscious, her mouth stretched in a silent scream behind a gag that prevented her from making sounds that might escape the building's soundproofing. Dr. Maxwell stood over her, wearing a surgical apron spattered with dark stains. In her hand was a device that looked like a modified ice pick, which she positioned against the patient's eye socket with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure many times before. Dr. Blackwood stood nearby, calmly taking notes on a clipboard, while Miss Pierce arranged surgical instruments on a metal tray with the casual efficiency of a dinner hostess setting out silverware. With horror, Donovan realized he was witnessing some kind of brain surgery being performed on a fully conscious patient without proper anesthesia. The woman's body convulsed against her restraints as Dr. Maxwell drove the instrument upward with practiced force, her movements as calm and controlled as if she were pruning roses rather than penetrating a human brain. Donovan fled through the darkening forest, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. When he reached town, he went directly to Sheriff Thomas Hargrove, a respected Civil War veteran who had maintained order in Cascade Falls for nearly 2 decades. Hargrove listened to Donovan's story with increasing concern, but cautioned him against spreading such explosive accusations. "These are respected medical professionals with powerful connections," he warned. "Making claims of this nature without absolute proof could destroy reputations and bring lawsuits that would bankrupt you and your family." Nevertheless, Hargrove was too conscientious to ignore such serious allegations. He promised to investigate discreetly, planning to visit the Institute the following day under the pretext of discussing security arrangements for an upcoming town event. Dr. Maxwell received the sheriff in the Institute's elegant reception room, serving tea from a silver service and inquiring about his family with seemingly genuine interest. When he carefully raised the subject of unusual lights and sounds reported by locals passing near the property at night, her expression showed only mild concern. "Sheriff Hargrove," she said, her British accent adding authority to her explanation, "many of our patients suffer from night terrors that can cause quite dramatic reactions. We sometimes conduct therapeutic sessions during evening hours when the subconscious mind is most accessible. I assure you, everything done here represents the very latest in psychiatric treatment." She offered to show him through the facility, leading him through impeccably maintained upper floors where patients sat in comfortable parlors reading books or working on needlepoint. The women he observed appeared calm, if somewhat subdued, responding to Dr. Maxwell's questions with quiet deference that seemed entirely appropriate for ladies of their social standing. When Sheriff Hargrove asked about seeing the basement facilities, Dr. Maxwell's smile never faltered, though something flickered briefly in her eyes. "I'm afraid our specialized treatment rooms are currently in use for sensitive procedures," she explained. "Patient confidentiality and the delicate nature of feminine nervous disorders make it inappropriate for male visitors to observe certain treatments. I'm sure you understand the necessity for discretion when dealing with young ladies from respected families." The explanation seemed reasonable, and Sheriff Hargrove left with his suspicions somewhat, but not entirely, allayed. Something about the Institute still troubled him, though he couldn't articulate precisely what. The patients he had observed seemed healthy enough, if unusually quiet, and Dr. Maxwell's credentials were impeccable. Perhaps Donovan had misinterpreted a legitimate medical procedure, viewing it through the lens of frontier superstition rather than modern science. Meanwhile, the flow of patients to the Woodland Institute continued steadily, with new arrivals coming by private rail cars from as far away as New York and Chicago. Wealthy families paid premium prices for Dr. Maxwell's revolutionary treatments, which he claimed could cure everything from depression and anxiety to sexual deviance and political radicalism. Most disturbing were the patterns that began emerging when patients were released back to their families. Catherine Holloway, once a brilliant young woman whose academic achievements had embarrassed her brothers at Harvard, returned home after 6 months at the Institute as a shadow of her former self. The sparkling intelligence that had defined her was gone, replaced by a docile compliance and inability to concentrate on even simple reading material. When shown her previous academic papers, she stared at them without comprehension, as if they had been written by a stranger. Elizabeth Rutherford, who had scandalized Boston society by leading suffragette marches and publishing pamphlets on women's rights, emerged from 4 months of treatment with no memory of her political activities and a new dedication to homemaking and submission to male authority. The transformation was so complete that her former colleagues in the suffrage movement could scarcely believe she was the same woman who had once chained herself to the Massachusetts State House in protest. Most disturbing of all was the case of Margaret Sinclair, whose wealthy husband had committed her to the Institute after she publicly accused him of adultery and filed for divorce. When she returned after 3 months of treatment, she not only withdrew her divorce petition but insisted she had never made any accusations against her beloved husband. She showed no recognition when confronted with her own signed affidavits and legal documents, describing them as obvious forgeries created by some disturbed woman who must have impersonated her. As years passed, Dr. Maxwell's reputation grew among medical professionals who marveled at her ability to effect complete personality transformations in patients previously considered untreatable. She published regular papers in respected medical journals describing innovative techniques for neurological modification and behavioral reconstruction that produced permanent cessation of problematic feminine behaviors. What these papers didn't reveal was that Dr. Maxwell was essentially performing crude lobotomies and other brain surgeries on conscious patients, deliberately damaging specific regions of the brain to eliminate undesired personality traits and behaviors. Her detailed anatomical knowledge allowed her to target areas associated with higher reasoning, memory, and emotional response with frightening precision, creating women who maintained basic functionality while losing the core elements of their identities. By 1910, the Woodland Institute had expanded its operations, adding a new wing to accommodate increasing demand. Dr. Maxwell had established connections with medical schools throughout America and Europe, selling her research findings and occasionally shipping preserved specimens to researchers who preferred not to inquire too deeply about their origins. The Institute's darkest secret lay in what happened to patients who didn't survive Dr. Maxwell's experimental procedures. Behind the mansion, deep in the surrounding forest, lay a series of unmarked graves containing the remains of women whose treatments had produced unfavorable outcomes. Dr. Blackwood maintained meticulous records of these failures, documenting precisely which procedures had resulted in death so that techniques could be refined for future patients. The breaking point came in 1937 with the arrival of Catherine Morgan, a 26-year-old journalist whose family had committed her to the Institute after discovering her investigation into women's disappearances at psychiatric facilities across America. Catherine had been working undercover at several institutions, documenting abuses and unexplained deaths for a planned exposé in a major newspaper. Unlike most patients who arrived broken by shame and family rejection, Catherine entered the Woodland Institute with clear purpose and a trained observer's eye. From the moment of her arrival, she began cataloging the Institute's operations, noting the glassy-eyed compliance of long-term patients and the suspicious absence of women who had supposedly been receiving intensive treatment in the basement facilities. Dr. Maxwell recognized the danger Catherine represented almost immediately. This young woman noticed details others missed, asked questions that probed inconsistencies, and maintained a level of mental resistance that most patients quickly lost under the Institute's conditioning procedures. Catherine was scheduled for emergency intervention, the Institute's euphemism for the most radical brain surgeries reserved for particularly resistant patients. However, she managed to steal a staff member's keys during a moment of confusion and escape her room during the pre-dawn hours when the Institute staffing was minimal. Instead of fleeing immediately, Catherine made her way to the basement, determined to gather evidence of what really happened in the specialized treatment rooms that most patients never remembered. What she discovered exceeded her worst fears. The basement contained not just surgical facilities, but an extensive archive documenting decades of systematic human experimentation. Journals recorded the effects of surgical interventions on different brain regions, with clinical detachment describing the personality changes, memory loss, and cognitive impairments that resulted from each procedure. Photographs documented before and after results, showing vibrant, intelligent women transformed into vacant-eyed shells of their former selves. Most damning was the mortality ledger, a record of 412 women who had died during experimental procedures, their bodies either buried in the forest behind the Institute or preserved for further study. Each entry included clinical details about the cause of death and lessons learned for improving future procedures. Catherine gathered as much documentation as she could carry, hiding papers throughout her clothing before making her escape through a delivery entrance as the morning staff began arriving. For 3 days, she evaded capture in the surrounding forest, surviving on berries and stream water while making her way toward the nearest neighboring town. When she finally reached authorities in Portland, Catherine's appearance and wild claims initially met with skepticism. However, the documentation she had stolen provided irrefutable evidence of crimes so monstrous that even hardened investigators were shocked. Federal authorities raided the Woodland Institute on June 17, 1937, but found the facility abandoned. Dr. Maxwell and her assistants had fled, taking their most valuable research and equipment but leaving behind evidence of decades of systematic torture and murder disguised as medical treatment. The investigation uncovered horrors that shook America's medical establishment. Hidden rooms contained preserved brains and other specimens, each meticulously labeled with the patient's name and details of the experimental procedures performed. Patient records documented the deliberate destruction of healthy brain tissue to eliminate everything from political opinions to sexual desire, creating women whose personalities had been surgically altered to meet society's expectations. Most horrifying was the discovery of the burial ground behind the Institute, where forensic experts eventually recovered the remains of 387 women who had been buried without markers or funeral rites, their deaths never reported to authorities or families. Many families who had been told their daughters or wives had run away or chosen to remain at the Institute learned decades later that their loved ones had actually died on Dr. Maxwell's operating table and been buried in unmarked graves. Despite one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, Dr. Eleanor Maxwell and her assistants were never found. Unconfirmed reports placed them in Argentina, working under assumed names at a private clinic serving wealthy South American families. Others suggested they had been given new identities through Operation Paperclip, the same program that brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II, in exchange for sharing their research with government agencies interested in mind control techniques. The full extent of the Woodland Institute's operations wasn't made public until 1997, when previously classified documents were released under the Freedom of Information Act. These records revealed that Dr. Maxwell had maintained regular correspondence with government researchers working on early versions of what would later become Cultra, sharing techniques for behavioral modification and memory management that would influence decades of classified research. The case of the Woodland Institute forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about America's medical history and the vulnerability of women in a society that pathologized independence and intellectual ambition. The systematic torture of hundreds of women, justified as necessary treatment for mental illness, reveals how easily medical authority can become a weapon of social control. Perhaps most disturbing is how many modern psychiatric techniques evolved from research like Dr. Maxwell's, knowledge gained through unethical experimentation that violated every principle of human dignity and medical ethics. When we celebrate medical progress, we rarely acknowledge the dark origins of many treatments we now take for granted. What do you think about this hidden chapter of American history? Could such systematic horrors really have remained secret for so long? The evidence suggests they did, and makes us wonder what other dark secrets might still be hidden in classified archives and unmarked graves. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories that powerful institutions tried to erase. Leave a comment letting us know what other dark chapters of American history you'd like us to explore next. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones some people don't want told.